Heavy rain and powerful winds batter the island nation of Singapore. Dozens of aircraft circle overhead, anxiously waiting for a gap in the storm. Amidst the chaos is Singapore Airlines Flight 319, a Boeing 777 carrying 280 people. It has come all the way from London, and now, as it waits, it's beginning to run dangerously low on fuel. Minute by minute, as the bad weather spreads, the pilots begin to run out of options. Will they make it into an airport, or will their fuel run out before they do? What you're about to see is a terrifying story of how quickly things can go from bad to worse in an aircraft. This is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 319. On the evening of October 24th, 2022, 280 passengers and crew boarded a Singapore Airlines Boeing 777 at London's Heathrow Airport. They were bound, naturally enough, for Singapore, a 13-hour journey. On board was a mixture of passengers. Some were Singaporeans heading home after a holiday. Others were business travellers going between the two major financial capitals, and some were European tourists using Singapore as a gateway to explore Southeast Asia. Up front, in command of the flight, was a 55-year-old captain. He had a huge amount of flying experience, more than 14,000 hours, just over 10,000 of which were on the 777. He would be acting as pilot monitoring for this flight, while the first officer flew the plane. That first officer, also from Singapore, was 31 years old, and had logged over 2,000 hours of flying time, almost all of which were on the Boeing 777. Joining the two pilots was a relief captain, who would take over from them in turn during the cruise, to give them a chance to rest before the arrival into Singapore. As part of their pre-flight duties, the three pilots reviewed the forecasted weather en route and at Singapore at their estimated time of arrival. The TAF, or Terminal Area Forecast, told them that they could expect periods of light to moderate thunderstorms and rain on arrival. This was pretty typical weather for Singapore, surrounded as it is by warm seas, which are highly conducive to thunderstorm build-ups year-round. The pilots considered taking on extra fuel to account for these storms, but given the fact that the weather was still within safe limits, and that there were no major weather systems along their route which they would need to avoid, the captain decided that the 106,000 kilograms of fuel that was planned was more than adequate. Besides, air traffic control usually gave them shortcuts through Europe, meaning that they would probably arrive with a little more in the tanks than planned. If things did go wrong, they had plenty of other options nearby, with alternate airports of Paya Lebar Air Base adjacent to Changi, their destination, and Kuala Lumpur and Senai just to the north in Malaysia. With preparations complete and everyone and everything on board, Flight 319 was now ready for pushback. It was a calm evening at Heathrow, and at just before 8 o'clock, the aircraft was pushed back from the gate. The pilots started the plane's two enormous engines and began taxiing out to runway 27 right. For Singaporeans, to board a Singapore Airlines flight is to be home, even before you've arrived back. Since the airline began operations in 1972, it has served as one of the most important symbols of the nation-state's brand. It's widely recognised as one of the world's premier airlines, with a reputation for safety, reliability, and service. But as Flight 319 taxied out, on the other side of the world, trouble was brewing. The pilots would soon find themselves in a fight for survival, which caught them completely off guard. At least for now, though, all was calm, as the first officer lined up on the runway at Heathrow and advanced the throttles to take off power. Within moments, Flight 319 was airborne and climbing out over London. Half an hour later, as it passed over Belgium, the 777 reached its initial cruising altitude of flight level 310, about 31,000 feet. The pilots would stay at this level until the plane burned off more fuel and became light enough to allow it to climb higher to a more fuel-efficient altitude. The cabin crew began their in-flight food and drink service, and the passengers ate and watched movies as the plane cruised high over Europe. They would be touching down in Singapore at 9 a.m. local time, which is 5 o'clock in the afternoon in Singapore. It was a long overnight flight, and once the food service was finished and the cabin lights were dimmed, many of the passengers would try to get some rest. Things were routine in the cockpit. As the pilots expected, air traffic control gave them several shortcuts over Europe due to the reduced flow of traffic at night. Sometime into the flight, the relief captain entered the cockpit and swapped out with the captain. After a few more hours, he would do the same for the first officer, allowing both to be fully rested by the time they had to land. All proceeded as normal as the plane cruised on autopilot towards the rising sun. Anybody listening out in the villages as it passed overhead would hear the faint whoosh it made through the air, racing serenely across the sky at 14 kilometers per minute. Nearly 12 hours had passed since Flight 319 had left London, and the 777 was now about to begin its descent into Singapore. After a long night in a cramped seat for many, another meal and snacks was now being served by the cabin crew. It was breakfast time in London. The relief captain had returned to his bunk to rest, and now, relatively well rested, the two operating pilots were back at the controls and planning their arrival. Ahead of them was Malaysia, and to its right the Strait of Malacca. They would fly just to the north of Kuala Lumpur and then approach Singapore from the north. According to their flight management computer, they would be landing in Singapore with 7,000 kilograms of fuel on board, well above the 3,000 required by law. This number exists to ensure that if pilots have to carry out a missed approach at their destination, there is still enough fuel to hold for 30 minutes at an altitude of 1,500 feet. Air traffic control had told them to expect an approach into runway 20 right at Singapore. This would be convenient for the crew, as it meant they would more or less be flying in a straight line all the way to the airport. But for the other flights currently making their way into runway 20 right, things were not so rosy. The winds had suddenly shifted direction, and now, aircraft landing were encountering tailwinds in excess of 10 knots. This was above the maximum tailwind limit for most commercial aircraft. This sudden shifting of the wind was to be expected for thunderstorm conditions. If the pilots of Flight 319 were lucky with their timing, they would just happen to be making an approach when the winds were more favourable. For now, given the conditions, controllers wouldn't be able to get the flight straight in. Some holding was required. Air traffic control cleared the flight to enter a holding pattern over a waypoint called Paspu, 40 miles to the north of the airport. The first officer keyed this into his flight management computer, and then began descending. At 5 minutes past 4, the pilots entered the holding pattern at Paspu. The captain began using his weather radar to map out the storms. The weather information they could get over the radio was useful, but the radar dish in the plane's nose cone showed the live weather situation like nothing else could. As they circled, the pilots could see heavy rain over Singapore, and concerningly, they could also see intense rain over their alternate airports of Paya Lebar and Senai. This was not a welcome sight. Pilots need options, and right now, it looked like this crew didn't have many. However, further to the south, on the Indonesian island of Batam, conditions looked better. The reported winds were light, and while there were some rain showers, they didn't seem to be as extensive as the ones currently blanketing Singapore. Eager not to run out of options, the pilots tucked away Batam as a potential alternate, if they couldn't make it into Singapore. As all of this was happening, the winds at Singapore had shifted dramatically. They now favoured runway 02 left, the opposite direction runway. For the pilots of Flight 319 and many other aircraft approaching from the north, this meant that after leaving the hold, they would have to proceed south, the long way in, instead of coming from the north as originally planned. The pilots reprogrammed the approach into their flight management system, changing the runway from 20 right to 02 left. Following this, the flight was cleared out of the holding pattern. The controller began giving the crew radar vectors to set them up for an approach to runway 02 left. By this point, the passengers had been strapped in, and the cabin crew had secured the cabin for landing. This was not going to be a pleasant approach. There was heavy rain over the airport, and the visibility had reduced to just 2 nautical miles. Within minutes of the controller telling this to the crew, the visibility had fallen further, to just 500 meters. This was not at all what the pilots had expected, but as long as the visibility didn't decrease further, they could carry out an approach. The pilots continued setting up the plane for landing, carrying out the approach checklist, and slowing the aircraft down. But now, just as they were getting ready, some bad news. The winds had switched around again. Aircraft trying to land on runway 02 left were now encountering tailwinds beyond the safe limit. It seemed like no matter what runway the airport used for landing and departing aircraft, the winds were swinging around to come from the opposite direction. By the time Flight 319 was ready to make its approach, 2 aircraft had already gone around because of the shifting winds and torrential rainfall. It wasn't looking good. But technically, the pilots could still try to make an approach and hope that things improved by the time they were nearly at the runway. However, before they got the chance to do that, the controller's voice crackled through the radio. All flights coming into Singapore were now suspended while controllers assessed the weather situation. From this point, the pilot's situation would begin to get increasingly complicated. The controller told Flight 319 to head to a waypoint called Samco and enter a holding pattern there. The expected holding time was 5 minutes. As the pilots flew towards Samco, they checked the weather information at Batam, which they had identified earlier as being a suitable alternate. Thankfully, the weather there was perfect. The pilots would need to make a decision quickly though. At this low altitude, they were burning fuel fast. If they had to hold for any longer than the 5 minutes that was expected, they would need to divert. The captain told the controller that they would be able to do just one round of the hold before needing to divert. Just after 4:30, Flight 319 entered the hold at Samco. Luckily for the crew, Samco was the same distance from Singapore as it was from Batam. So, in a sense, it would be just as easy to go to one as to the other. Now, they just needed word from the controller about which airport would take them. But as they circled, more bad news came through the radio. The visibility in Singapore had dropped below 500 meters, and the weather showed no sign of improving. Aware that Flight 319 was low on fuel, the controller told Indonesian ATC of the flight's situation and let them know that they may need to divert to Batam. However, at this point, the pilots still preferred to land at Singapore. It was their destination after all, and there was always the chance that the weather would improve before they got there. But every minute the pilots spent in the holding pattern, the number of approaches they could attempt was reduced. And in weather like this, it was not inconceivable that they would need to make more than one approach. The captain's decision not to take on extra fuel in London was now slowly coming back to haunt him. As the plane approached Samco again to commence its second hold there, the captain told ATC so as to remind him that after this, they would need to divert. The controller directed the flight to head south. This was not what the pilots wanted. To fly south would be to fly away from both Singapore and Batam. The captain asked the controller why he was directing them away from both of their possible landing airports. The controller told him that Singapore was still not accepting arrivals and that Batam had not yet approved their diversion. Flight 319 was stuck in limbo. Not wanting to head away from a suitable airport, the captain came up with a compromise. Rather than entering another hold or heading south, he asked if he could perform an orbit over Samco, which is a continuous 360-degree turn rather than the usual racetrack pattern. The controller approved this. This was a last-ditch effort on the part of the captain to hold out an extra few minutes on the off chance that Singapore became available. But before they even got to the point of carrying out an orbit, their fuel reached the point where, if they didn't divert, they would begin eating into the part of the fuel which they must land with, their final reserve. Flight 319 now had to divert. The captain told the controller that they needed to go to Batam now. With this, the captain took over from the first officer as pilot flying. His experience would give them the best chance of making it into Batam the first time round. The captain made a PA telling the passengers and cabin crew that due to the weather in Singapore, they would have to divert to Batam. It wasn't the news they wanted to hear, but at this point, they had no idea quite how serious their situation was about to become. The controller instructed them to fly heading south in order to come around for an approach to runway 22 at Batam. The captain again asked if Singapore was accepting arriving aircraft, which they weren't. Even at this late stage, the pilots were still trying to see if they could land at Singapore, when that ship had long since sailed. The arrival controller vectored them south of Batam, first to a heading of 120 degrees, and then east, where they would be sequenced for an approach into runway 22. This was a rather indirect route, but the flight had still not been approved for landing at Batam. As the fuel level fell ever lower, the pressure on the pilots mounted. Would the flight make it into Batam before it began eating into its final reserve fuel? Or would the pilots soon have to declare a fuel emergency? The first officer wasn't long making the first step in that direction. He told air traffic control that they were now at minimum fuel. This was not an emergency situation, but it let air traffic control know that the flight was now committed to landing at Batam, and that any change in their clearance might result in the plane landing with less than its final reserve fuel. In other words, if there was any further delay, the pilots would have to declare an emergency. Still, the controller told the pilots that Batam had not yet approved their arrival. The flight continued on course. Just a few minutes later, at 4:53 p.m, when the aircraft was 13 nautical miles from Batam, its computers predicted that it would reach the airport with just the final reserve fuel in its tanks. The pilots now had no choice. The captain declared Mayday fuel to air traffic control. Having used the word Mayday, Flight 319 was now treated as an emergency aircraft. Approval or no approval, it could now make an approach to Batam. The approach controller turned the aircraft north and handed the pilots off to the airport's tower controller. As the captain flew the plane, the first officer reviewed the approach charts for the airport. Unfortunately for them, owing to the wind direction, runway 22 was in use. The reason this was unfortunate is that unlike runway 04, runway 22 didn't have an ILS approach. Pilots generally prefer runways with ILS approaches, as these have radio beams which give both lateral and vertical guidance down to the runway. Runway 22 just had a VOR approach, which can only give lateral guidance. So, for this approach, the pilots would have to get their vertical guidance from their charts, with the first officer telling the captain what altitude he had to be at particular distances from the runway. This was an inconvenience more than anything though. The real problem with the VOR approach, especially in this weather, is that the minimums, the height by which the pilots have to see the runway in order to land, are higher. As you can see here, if they were using the ILS approach to runway 04, they would be able to descend all the way down to 390 feet before they would have to commence a go-around. Whereas here, on the VOR approach to runway 22, they would not be able to descend below 440 feet. This might not seem like much of a difference, but in marginal conditions, it could be the difference between seeing the runway and not. The pilots commenced their approach. As the captain began descending, the first officer read out the altitudes that they needed to be at different checkpoints along the approach. The 777 is a large aircraft, and it burns a lot of fuel, especially at low altitudes. The pilots knew they weren't going to get many attempts at this. The autopilot was flying the plane at this point, keeping it lined up with the runway, while the captain controlled the descent rate. He was monitoring the lateral position of the aircraft using this pink symbol here, which represents the inbound course towards the runway, or more correctly, towards the radio beacon just off the end of the runway. If the plane drifted to the right, the symbol would move to the left, and the autopilot would follow it back. But as Flight 319 descended through 1600 feet, the tower delivered some bad news. The winds had now shifted, and were coming from behind the aircraft. As they were gusting to 30 knots, they were well outside of what the plane was capable of landing with. The conditions the pilots had met in Singapore had now spread to Batam as well. The captain had no choice but to abandon the approach. He pushed the throttles forwards, raised the landing gear, and climbed the aircraft back up towards 2,000 feet. The pressure was beginning to mount. Now, it was clear that the aircraft would be landing with less than the final reserve in its tanks. To make matters worse, storm clouds were beginning to make their way in towards the airport. The pilots had to dodge these as they carried out the missed approach and began setting themselves up for another approach, this time in the opposite direction to runway 04. Despite their situation being far from ideal, it did have a silver lining. Runway 04 had an ILS approach. This was the kind of approach pilots were used to doing, and the fact that it had a glide slope for vertical guidance meant that they could use the autopilot all the way down to the runway, and even use it to land the plane. In fact, that's exactly what the captain intended to do. But to get to that point, he first needed to wrangle it around towards the runway, and so he began turning the plane to the left. a good landing starts with a good approach, and a good approach takes time to set up. But the captain wasn't sure whether he had this time. So, rather than taking a longer path which set him up cleanly for a long approach, he began turning the plane around, doing a teardrop maneuver to line the plane up to intercept the ILS almost immediately. This increased the workload dramatically in the cockpit, with the captain ensuring that his turn would set the aircraft up on a sensible intercept course, and the first officer reprogramming the flight management computer for an ILS approach to the new runway. By the time the plane had completed most of the turn back, the pilots were able to see the runway. The first officer told the controller that they had the runway in sight, and the controller handed them back to tower control, who would handle the flight as it attempted to land. Because the plane was so close to the runway, the captain figured that the autopilot would be of little use in getting it onto the ILS quickly. So he disconnected the autopilot and began flying the plane manually. His plan was that once he had maneuvered the plane onto the glide slope and localizer beams, he would re-engage the autopilot and let the plane land itself. By this point, intense downpours had shrouded the aircraft from view, reducing visibility to just 500 meters. Given the intense workload the pilots were under, the first officer hadn't contacted the tower. Both crew members were intently focused on the flight path of the aircraft. The controllers couldn't see the flight through the heavy rain, and so they didn't issue any landing clearance. Normally at Batam, as in most airports, pilots intercept the ILS at an altitude of about 2,000 to 3,000 feet at a distance of 10 to 15 miles. But that's not what Flight 319 was doing. The captain had kept the plane so close to the airport that now, as he finally got a signal on his primary flight display showing where the glide slope and localizer were, he was only 800 feet in the air. This was, to put it mildly, a haphazard approach. He re-engaged the autopilot and the aircraft continued flying towards the runway. But moments later, the no autoland warning appeared on his primary flight display. For some reason, the plane had judged that the autopilot was unable to land it. The reason for this soon became obvious when the captain checked where the plane was in relation to the localizer and glide slope beams. The plane was nearly fully off the scale both laterally and vertically. Automatic landings require even more attention and precision than manual landings, and the way this approach was going, an autoland was simply out of the question. This warning startled the captain though. He had been counting on the autopilot to get the job done, and now, just moments from landing, that plan had to be completely thrown out. He disconnected the autopilot and began flying the plane manually to bring it back onto the correct path. But it was too late. The plane was too close to the runway for there to be time to get back on track. Just 130 feet above the ground, the captain decided to go around. The 777's massive engines roared to full power and the plane lumbered skyward. This had now become a sickening situation. 2 failed landing attempts on 2 different runways, and now the plane was getting critically low on fuel. Most airlines have a policy that after 2 missed approaches, if a third attempt is considered unlikely to succeed, the pilots should divert. But with what little fuel it had left, this aircraft was nowhere near in a position to head back to Singapore, or anywhere else for that matter. They had flown to Batam and were now committed to landing there no matter what. With almost 280 people sitting behind them, the pressure was immense. In his first communication with the tower since the first approach, the captain told the controller that he was going around. As it turned out, the captain's decision to carry out a very short approach and his choice to do an autoland likely cost the pilots this precious second attempt at landing. If he had just set himself up for a longer approach and tried to land it himself, the plane would probably be safely on the ground at this point. But there was one more reason that the approach failed, and it had to do with the pilot's preparation. The final approach course to the runway was not perfectly aligned with the runway itself. What this meant was that an autoland was not even possible to begin with. When the pilots reviewed their charts during the preparation for the approach, they overlooked this important detail, that the final approach course for the runway was 41 degrees, while the runway heading itself was 42 degrees. As 777 pilots for Singapore Airlines, they were used to flying into major international airports, most of which were suitable for automatic landings. Batam was not one of those airports. What's more, they had grown reliant on the airline's own briefing documents, which would normally point out important information like whether certain runways could be used for autolands. But Singapore Airlines didn't systematically go through all of the airports it flew into and note these kinds of things. Rather, these briefing documents were cobbled together over the years by pilots' experiences flying into these airports. And for Batam Airport, the fact that autoland could not be used was not mentioned. But there was no time for a detailed look at what had gone wrong just yet. The captain began turning the plane to the right and climbed up to 3,000 feet. He flew parallel to the runway, aiming to set up for another approach to runway 04. The controller told the pilots that the wind was 340 degrees at 7 knots, not strongly favouring either runway. But the captain was already beside the airport and heading southwest to set up for an approach to runway 04. He told the controller that due to his low fuel state, he could only now land on runway 04, and that this attempt had to be successful. As the captain was just about to begin a right-hand turn to head towards the runway, the controller radioed in with some good news. The visibility at the airport had increased from 500 metres to 800 metres. This was still pretty poor by most standards, but the pilots would take every advantage they could get at this point. The captain began turning towards the runway and putting the aircraft into a descent. Wanting to avoid a repeat of the previous approach where the pilots forgot to contact the tower controller, the approach controller kept the flight on his frequency and relayed messages between the tower controller and the pilots. The captain continued his turn. He was too close to the extended centerline to intercept the localizer from the side that he was flying on, so he had to continue his turn around, overshooting the beam and capturing it from the other side. The pilots slowed down, lowering the flaps and gear in sequence, and setting up for what simply had to be their final attempt to land. The fuel tanks were almost empty. Just a few inches of Jet A1 was now sloshing around at the bottom of them. Still, the captain couldn't see the runway through the cloud. He was relying on his glide slope and localizer indications to ensure that he was lined up with the runway. Finally, when Flight 319 burst out of the clouds, the horrible truth appeared right in front of the pilots. The plane was too high and way to the left of the runway centerline. Normally, this would be grounds for a go-round, but the pilots didn't have that luxury. They simply had to make it in, or risk running out of fuel. The captain nosed the plane down, increasing its descent rate to 1,400 feet per minute, twice the normal rate. The passengers felt themselves getting light in their seats as the plane dipped and then banked to the left as the captain desperately tried to line it up with the runway. This was a last-ditch attempt to get the plane on the ground. The picture the pilots saw out their windows would have looked totally foreign compared to the stable approaches that they were used to flying. But they were committed now. They simply had to land. But suddenly, sensing the rapid rate of descent, the plane's ground proximity warning system called out,
"Sink rate."
The captain now had a horrible choice to make. He could follow his training and carry out a go-round in response to this warning, or he could continue to land and risk crashing his plane onto the runway after what had been a massively unstable approach. Neither option was safe, but he had just moments to decide. The captain followed his training and reluctantly carried out a go-round. Barely 200 feet above the ground, he began hauling the nose up and set go-round power on the aircraft's engines. The aircraft, now over 100 tons lighter than it was when it took off, rattled and shook as it roared into the rainy sky above Batam for the third time that afternoon. The passengers were now growing panicked. How had they still not landed? What was wrong with their plane that they never seemed to be able to make it in? For the pilots, the nightmare was even worse. Unlike the passengers, they were fully aware of what the problem was. They had now failed to land on 3 separate occasions, and terrifyingly, they didn't even have enough fuel to go back around and land on runway 04 again. At any moment now, their engines would splutter out and stop. When they did, the aircraft would lose most of its electrical and hydraulic power, and it would become nothing more than a massive glider, descending helplessly towards the earth below. In that state, the odds that they could make it back to the runway for a safe landing were vanishingly small. Fueled with adrenaline and pure survival instinct, the captain decided that he would do something generally considered unthinkable in a passenger jet of this size. As he reached 2,000 feet, he started a tight 180-degree turn, known as a teardrop maneuver, to set himself up to land on runway 22. As he did this, he began descending, while the first officer lowered the flaps and the gear. This was truly their last chance. The approach controller told the crew that the wind was from the northwest at 15 knots. This was not ideal. This meant that they had a tailwind of about 5 knots and a crosswind of about 15 knots. They were now uncomfortably close to their tailwind limit of 10 knots, but they had no other options. It was either land fast or not at all. The captain continued wrangling the aircraft around, and this time he would be carrying out the approach fully visually. Finally, as he rolled out of the turn, the runway came into view. The rules didn't matter at this point. Stabilized approach, unstabilized. What mattered was that nothing prevented the pilots from getting the aircraft safely down onto the runway. As the plane neared the runway, the pressure mounted. With the tailwind, the pilots were travelling faster than they were used to, but there was no room for error. To go around this time would almost certainly lead to total fuel exhaustion and the loss of both engines. At 4,000 metres long, the runway itself was more than enough to take a 777, so this wasn't an issue of running out of space. Instead, it was entirely a question of whether the approach would be stable enough to lead to a safe landing. The passengers held on tight as the plane neared the ground, swaying somewhat from left to right as the captain tried to keep it on course. Would this landing be successful, or would they end up rocketing skywards for the 4th time this afternoon?
Minimums 200.
Their answer came at 19 minutes past 5 as Flight 319 roared over the runway threshold and finally touched down. The sense of relief in the cockpit was overwhelming. After nearly an hour-long ordeal, the 280 people on board were safe. With barely enough fuel left to keep the engines running, the captain taxied back to the gate at Batam. Given how close this flight had come to disaster, it was only a matter of time before a similar incident happened again, but without such a happy ending. So, as a result of this incident, Singapore Airlines revised its threat and error model, creating stricter guidelines for diverting to an alternate airport when the likelihood of making it to the destination airport looks slim, or when controllers are not able to provide definitive updates. The airline also began reviewing its airport briefing documents to ensure that every airport was covered in the same level of detail, including whether autolands were permitted. They also reminded pilots to make this assessment on their own, by using the published charts to determine if the localizer signal is aligned with the runway heading. Singapore Airlines also took the lessons from this incident and created a simulator exercise for its pilots, which replicates the conditions faced by the crew of Flight 319. Its purpose is to test pilots' ability to apply the airline's fuel policy, and to make safe decisions in changing weather conditions. The passengers and crew of Flight 319 were lucky, but not all crews have been this fortunate. Check out my video on Avianca Flight 52 to see what happens when things don't go so well.